Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Council, the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of solar radiation modification and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have with us 5 expert guest speakers to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. I'd like to ask them in a moment to introduce themselves, but just to quickly outline here, we will have a discussion with our guest speakers around this virtual campfire. The idea is not to have long speeches, but to have a discussion. And after that, we'll have a session on questions that you will ask the participants. So let me start by perhaps introducing myself. My name is János Pásztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since the middle of 2016. Sounds like a very long time. Before that, for close to 4 decades, I worked in a number of UN organizations, but also a few non-governmental entities. My last position was UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, working in New York, working amongst other things for the Paris Agreement. Before that, I worked for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNEP, WWF, Stockholm Environment Institute, a whole range of institutions. But the bottom line is I've worked on climate change and sustainable development for the last 4 decades, and obviously not very well because we still have a little bit of a problem, otherwise known as the climate crisis. So I owe to my grandchildren to try to do something about that. So this is a part of that contribution. So with that, let me ask our guest speakers to say a few words about themselves. Ambuj, can I start with you, please?
Sure. I'm Ambuj Sagar. I'm a professor of policy studies at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, India. Although my background is in engineering, I've been working on policy questions relating to science, technology, and development, broadly speaking, over the last couple of decades or a little bit more than that. I'm particularly interested, since I'm in India, I'm particularly interested in how many of these questions play out in a developing country context. And I'm also interested in issues relating to fairness and equity, as many of these issues that we're thinking about also have a kind of a global perspective in which they play out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambuj. Holly, would you like to continue?
Sure. My name is Holly Buck, and I'm an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University at Buffalo in New York. But my training has been in the sociology of development, and I've been interested in this intersection between development and solar geoengineering for about 10 years. And the key question I'm interested in is how can publics have more say in the design of these technologies as they emerge?
Thank you. Charles.
Thank you so much. My name is Charles, and I work for an organization known as a Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And basically, we are a coalition of organizations in Africa that actually advocate for justice when it comes to matters to do with climate change, particularly because Africa is a continent that is a contributing risk to global greenhouse gas emissions. We only contribute about 4%, but this is also the continent that's so much affected by climate change. Talk about drought, talk about flooding, and so on and so forth. So I'm a climate change specialist. That's what I've been doing in the last 15 years. I've worked for several organizations, including the Green Belt Movement that was headed by the late Professor Sagar, the Nobel laureate Peace Prize winner for 2004. Then I worked for East Africa Audit Society, and now I'm working for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. I normally focus more on Red Plus activities or Red Plus projects across the continent. And also I do coordinate work happening around our 48 chapters within 48 countries in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Pablo, would you like to continue?
Yes, hello. Thank you, friends, for being here. I'm Pablo Suarez from Argentina. Used to be a math geek, became a researcher on climate and disasters. In the late 90s, it was obvious that all of this was coming our way unless we did something about it. And then I became a humanitarian worker. 15 years ago, I joined the global Red Cross family, the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, where I am in charge of research and innovation. And since 2009, when I learned about the prospects of geoengineering, especially solar geoengineering or sprinkling stuff in the upper atmosphere, I became very concerned about what this could mean for all of us. And since 2010, I've been very actively involved, and I'm super grateful to C2G and so many others creating this space for conversation.
Thank you, Pablo. And last but not least, Matthias.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Matthias Honegger, and I've been not quite as long in this game as most of the other panelists, since I'm a bit younger, but I've started looking into the implications of solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide removal back in 2012, when I also started working in climate policy. And since then, I've tried to sort of balance the academic work with the applied policy consultancy work in the process of the UNFCCC. And I'm looking forward to continue contributing as best I can to this conversation.
Thank you very much. And this is great. We have really 5 very interesting speakers from actually 4 continents. So this is quite nice. And I look forward to the discussion. Now, just a few words about C2G, the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We are a small foundation-funded initiative. We have 16 people working virtually and doing that even before COVID on 4 continents. And we have a very simple mission. Our mission is to catalyze the creation of effective governance for these approaches that can alter the climate, in particular carbon dioxide removal, large-scale carbon dioxide removal, and solar radiation modification. We are impartial about the use or not of these approaches. One important part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like the one we hopefully will have today during this Campfire Chat. Now, the purpose of this Campfire Chat is it's really important for us to show that there are the diversity of views on these issues. I think that it's fair to say that solar radiation modification is a particularly challenging topic anyway, but even on the less challenging topics, there are different perspectives because people come from different perspectives. So what we hope to achieve is that each of you, the speakers, will express your perspectives, and we try, we don't have to convince each other, we don't have to come to a conclusion. The idea is to demonstrate. Now, in order to get the full perspectives, you of course would need a representative of all the possible perspectives, and that's not possible for a Campfire Chat because Zoom doesn't have enough windows for that. So, but we do try, and we aim for the maximum in terms of geography, gender diversity, and of course socio-political context for the speakers. And we obviously can't achieve that with any particular Campfire Chat, but on the whole, in this series of Campfire Chats, I think we've done pretty well with over 50 experts involved in these processes. So there we go. Now, one thing to say that I look forward to lots of things that you will say, but of course, whatever is said here is not the view of C2G necessarily. It may, of course, be that. So there we go. Now, in terms of the topic here, just a few words, and I will go through this very quickly because I'd like to focus on the discussion. But I think for those of us who are connected to this event, it's we don't need to emphasize too much that we're in trouble in terms of the global heating, climate change. Even the situation currently is just slightly over 1 degree above historical average, and the impacts are clear wherever one looks. The forest fires, the floods, extreme heat, not just in some cities in hotter parts of the world, but even in the Arctic, we're having extreme heat situations. So, and I can go into the details, but I will not. What is important is that studies, including those from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, show that in addition to the emission reductions, which have to go into a massively increased sort of turbo mode of reducing emissions, in addition to that, we will still need carbon dioxide removal. How much, which technology, and those are questions that need to be answered. But But the reality is that the world is not yet in turbo mode when it comes to emission reductions. And so we're not doing even the desired scenario that we should be. So many scientists are saying that we may also need solar radiation modification or change of albedo to reflect sunlight. Now, there are different methods for solar radiation modification. The one that is most talked about is stratospheric aerosol injection. Get some particles in the stratosphere that reflect sunlight so to cool the planet. But there are other methods such as marine cloud brightening or even very local ground level albedo modifications as well. Now, what is important for our discussion is that, of course, solar radiation modification, or SRM in short, is not a solution. It's not a solution because it doesn't address the cause of the problem. But it does address the impacts, and maybe, and that's what the scientists are telling us, maybe it's useful to buy time until the world decarbonizes or to reduce the overshoot that beyond the 1.5 to 2 degree goal. And therefore, if ever solar radiation modification is to be used, then it has to be done in conjunction with carbon dioxide removal and emission reduction. So that's the sort of the overall context. Now, there are many scientific, technical, and governance challenges, and it is very controversial. But if our story is that if we might need it one day, then we at least need to talk about it. We at least need to understand it, to know what the risks and benefits are, so that we can then make informed choices whether or not to make use of these approaches one day. So these, of course, bring up lots and lots of interesting governance challenges. Where are the gaps at the national, international level? What are existing intergovernmental frameworks doing? What are non-state actors doing? Should one pursue research? And if yes, how? So we can't address all of these issues, but I think we will address some of them in our discussion. And that's what I look forward to in the next hour. So with that, just to remind our participants that I will start the discussion by asking each of the speakers to say a few words. In this case, actually, I'll be asking pretty much the same question from each one of them. Then they'll have an initial response, and then we'll have some discussion with just the speakers. And then at some point, we will open up for questions from the participants. For that, please note that there is a Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom screen, so you can enter your questions there. And you will see when you open that box that there's also a like button. So if there's a question that you like, please click that. That will give it a higher priority. If there are many questions, we may not have time to address them all, and then we'll start with addressing those questions that have a few likes. So please make use of that. There's also a chat button. You're welcome to chat if you like, but we will not be monitoring that carefully, and don't put questions into that chat box. So that's the mechanics. Now let's get started, and I would like to start asking the questions from the speakers. As I said, it will be the same question, and I look forward to hearing their maybe different perspectives on the answer. So the question is that, given the context of the Sustainable Development Goals that have been agreed, and what might come after that, because we presume that after 2030, there will be another set of revised Sustainable Development Goals. So in that context, can you please explain, based on your perspective, why the world should or should not make use of solar radiation modification? And given the nature of our Campfire Chat, can you actually explain the reasons why or why not? So it's not just the outcome, but why or why not? And also explain if you are not in a position to, at this point, to say why or why not. So that's the basic question. And let's start with Matthias. I'd like to ask you, Matthias, as you said, you are European, you live in Western Europe, you work in a particular context. How does that look from your side?
Well, so one of the things that you asked is to reflect on what drives us towards this topic. Why are we even looking or talking or researching on this? And for me, it comes down to fundamentally, I think we need good societal decisions in general and also in this domain. And I think, as you describe, we're making great progress on climate change in many areas, but it's not enough. And as the impacts that we're already seeing today are going to mount going forward over the next few decades, the pressure for quick and far-reaching decisions will mount as well. And fundamentally, I believe what makes us strong is really if we can take decisions jointly and on a shared basis of rudimentary understanding of even what it is that we're talking about. So in case of solar radiation modification, some of those conversations, what is this object that we're talking about, are still taking place. They have to take place and they will take time. And I think as more and more stakeholders, more and more people all over the world start looking at these questions, we need to have that discussion spread and take place on a broader level, and that takes time. And I think for me, it's really a race against the ticking clock of mounting climate pressures, which will force some very uncomfortable decisions going forward, and this growing capacity of addressing these questions, which ultimately are political questions, collective choices that have to, in my view, really take place through democratic processes. And I think we see in the unfolding global health crisis right now, the challenges of what happens when you have to take decisions rashly, overnight, basically. You know, in the big picture, this 1 year has really given us a microcosm of these challenges in coming to some degree of a shared understanding, which really is the basis for taking policy choices. And that's what's driven me to this, really trying to bring together the understanding of the challenge. And I think the SDGs help in structuring our understanding because they kind of provide a vision for the future that the international community has agreed upon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Matthias. Without putting words, exact words in your mouth, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that the climate impact pressures are going to force us to consider this. You're not saying we have to use it, but to consider, to have to think about it. And then what you were saying is we need this broad societal discussion. I'd like to come back to that later because that could be a very complicated process. But anyway, let's leave that for now. Maybe next, I would like to ask you, Holly. You live and work in America, in the United States. Not exactly the country that has been it could be, but it hasn't been the leader in climate response. So how does that look from your perspective, this question?
Yeah, I mean, I would be skeptical of anybody who says with absolute certainty that we either should be doing this or shouldn't be, because we haven't done the research. I mean, if there's one key message I want people to know is that this is just kind of a very rudimentary idea that looks promising in some modeling simulations. It's very different than something that we know about what will happen in the real world. We need to know about things like stratospheric chemistry. We need to know about ecosystem impacts from changes in the type of sunlight that's emerging. So it's just, I feel like it's still very early stages for investigating this. And so we need a body of research. We don't need one single study that says, hey, this looks great, or another single study in the press that's like, oh, this looks terrible. I mean, we've had, just look in the past week or two, there's been one study, Schneider et al., 2020 in PNAS, that says basically that solar geoengineering is not a fail-safe option to prevent global warming because of some feedback effects that would take place later on in a very high CO2 world. You could read that and assemble a picture with some other papers that says, oh, this is not promising, we should forget about it. There's also another paper just published in Environmental Research Letters that looked at whether solar geoengineering could lower future risk of day zero droughts in Cape Town in South Africa, and found that compared to a pretty bad climate change scenario, it could offset 90% of the risk. So you could assemble the picture of those and say, oh, maybe this will help with sustainable development. But we need a body of research that's A, international, and B, looks systematically at impacts on all the SDGs. Because the research we have right now is driven by the interests of individual research groups, a select group of funders. And so this is where maybe my positionality in America is coming in, that I'm seeing how the innovation ecosystem here works and how it's not equal, it's not diverse, it's driven by this incentive structure of a neoliberalized economy, which is in turn influenced by the media ecosystem and the narratives you can tell about your research. So the science we have is actually in a really sorry state, not diverse, not well-resourced. It's not the science that we idealize, and we really need to change this picture so we could get answers to some of these questions.
Can I just ask you a quick question about this? The science is that it's not the right kind of science, but maybe just a couple of thoughts on, and we can come back into detail later, of how could we go about getting the right science?
Yeah, I've been thinking that perhaps the CGIAR program might be kind of a model. So, I mean, even though there's been perhaps some critiques of it, this was formerly the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research. It involves 15 research centers, mostly based in the Global South, collaboratively working on food security for decades now, perhaps too much on maybe genetic engineering, but I don't know. I mean, I think they've come up with incredible research and have increased capacity for research in other countries. We need to be thinking long-term about building capacity to do research in these areas, because this isn't a problem just for this decade. It's going to take capacity throughout the rest of the century.
Okay. Well, we may come back to this, but it was also important that you said this, that it's actually this solar radiation modification, atmospheric aerosol injection is an idea. It's not a thing yet. It's an idea, and that we need a body of research, not just one or two papers, before we can be clear about these things. Okay, let's move on. Ambuj, you live and work in India, developing country, and you said you're particularly interested in those issues. India is, of course, a large emitter in absolute sense, but not in per capita terms. So yet it's heavily impacted by global heating. So how does this question look from your perspective? Please turn your mic on.
Sorry about that. So I think if the question really is in the context of the SDGs, what one thinks about solar radiation management, I mean, I think I'm broadly in agreement with my colleagues that that given the way, and actually even how you started the conversation, that given how we are progressing, or let me say not progressing, in addressing the climate challenge, and how a severely disrupted climate, which is the direction which we're heading today, is certainly going to have implications for a great number of the Sustainable Development Goals, then I think we cannot not avoid thinking about a full portfolio of options to address the climate impacts, and therefore solar radiation management is something that I think we have to think about. At this point, at least from my point of view, I don't think we have enough information at all to say whether we should use SRM or whether we should not use SRM. But it may well be that down the line, the alternative of not using SRM may be worse than using it. And so in some sense, I think, for me at least, it's too early to say whether SRM should be used or not used. Having said that, I do think, and as my colleagues have also said, I do think that we have to then, if SRM is indeed going to be something we need to have as a possible portfolio of part of a portfolio of options for the future, then we do need to understand the kind of questions people have said. Is it actually a feasible way to achieve the objective of managing climate impacts? Can we or can we not control the outcome? How do we understand the different kinds of risks imposed by solar radiation management? And then how do we protect against the risks? I think we need to start thinking about those questions now. And I think I agree with Holly that the research on this is fairly sparse and mostly from the north. And so I think that does mean that we have to think about maybe understanding these questions in a more different way than we've done so far. And then I think there's a second set of questions, which relates to even if SRM is a possible feasible option through which we can actually manage climate impact somewhat, under what conditions do we use that? Who has a knowledge base? Who decides to implement and in what form? If you have to terminate, who decides to terminate? So these are the kind of the governance questions that you were talking about. So I think there's both science questions, there are governance questions, and then there are questions of how to link the science to the governance. I think Matthias talked about our current situation with COVID. I think all of us who are in the space of generating knowledge to inform policy, I think it's been a very sobering experience of how a lot of decisions have got made in the absence of full appreciation of the knowledge out there, and sometimes the knowledge is not clear. And I think decisions have been made rather recklessly in many cases. And so I think there are questions relating to science, there are questions relating to policy and governance, and there are questions relating to the relationship between science and governance. So I think it's all. I think there are a lot of unknowns here. And if we want to think about SRM for the future, I think we have to understand these unknowns to say, to ask exactly maybe down the line the question that you asked: should we use SRM or should we not use SRM in order to reduce the impacts of altered climate on sustainable development goals? And how do we think about managing the risks of the two different options, SRM or not SRM? So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. And just a couple of points from you that you mentioned about if things continue this way, we cannot avoid or cannot not avoid talking about this and looking at this as a potential, but we need to understand. And I think all of you are saying that we just don't know enough. But then, of course, the question of research comes, and I want to come back to that afterwards, because I think that may be relevant for all of us. But let me continue with these initial questions, and I'd like to move on to Charles. Charles, you're also living and working in a developing country, and at the same time you're fighting for climate justice. So in that context, how does this look from your perspective? Can you share a few thoughts with us?
Thank you so much, Janos. I think we must first and foremost ask ourselves why or how did we reach where we are now in terms of climate change that is being experienced across the globe, and more so in my continent, Africa. Even though we are contributing, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're only contributing 4% to the global, greenhouse gas emissions, but most of the effects are actually being felt home in terms of floods, in terms of drought, in terms of erratic rainfall patterns affecting the farmers and all that. So climate change is an issue, and for sure we must come up with a solution. But then we must ask ourselves, so who is responsible for climate change? And no doubt about it, it is the actions of human beings. Now, if you look at the graph of the emissions since, I think, the 15th century, you realize that from all the way up to 17th century, there was constant, release of greenhouse gases. But from the 17th century, we started getting astronomical, spike in terms of the emissions. Why? Because of course our population is increasing globally, but also we started using fossil fuels. We started cutting down, of course, the carbon sinks, which are trees, but there was a balance in the ecosystem before. But our actions are the ones contributing to this. And therefore, when you're talking about now solutions, we must think about sustainable solutions that are going to bring the change that we actually need. At the moment, there are clear solutions that we already, are implementing, and whether or not we're implementing in the right way is a different thing altogether. We know for sure it is so simple to establish more carbon sinks by planting more trees. And if I say this to my mother at home or to my grandmother at home, she'll resonate very well with that. She'll understand, her position and her responsibility in bringing back the globe or the world the way it's supposed to be, and to avoid these particular effects of climate change. But having said that, I think it's important to think about this issue of solar radiation modification very carefully. And like we're saying, of course, information is still very scanty, just like we're struggling with COVID-19. We're still trying to understand, what will be the impacts of this kind of large-scale removals and again, adjustment of the solar radiation. Whether we're talking about injection of the aerosols in the air, or we're talking about creating some poles on the cloud so that infrared light can go back, or if we're talking about, brightening of the clouds, we must ask ourselves, what will be the impact or the side? Remember, every scientific discovery, there's always some side effects. Now, I'm not very sure whether we can be able to cope with the side effects of a high magnitude, like changing basically the entire climatic, conditions of different places. If, for example, we decide to alter, say, probably solar radiation in a given region, if this is localized, for example, what happens, for example, in terms of now removing that particular heat and the reflection of those particular infrared, rays back to the sun or back to the space. Now, when that cool effect comes, how, and I'm not a scientist focusing so much on this, I don't know how much we can be able to control how much of the cooling then happens, to the extent that we don't know what that means to atmospheric pressure of that particular localized region, and the effect that we have in a different area. I mean, in one common home, just like emissions happening in the US are affecting us here in Africa. I mean, it's very, very difficult to say that we want to probably maybe just experiment in a certain particular area without particularly affecting other areas because of the change in atmospheric pressure and so on and so forth. So I think it's important first and foremost to really critically analyze and really test and retest these technologies before even thinking about proposing them, for this kind of a thing. Number two, there is a whole question of the cost implications. For sure, and research has it, that if you are ready to launch these kind of interventions, it's going to be very, very, very expensive. At the moment, we are talking about supporting, adaptation, especially in the countries where we are most affected, but you only get 10% of climate change funds getting into adaptation, for example. We are talking about simple technologies for renewables, because again, if we have to reverse the situation, we have to deal with the issue of the fossil fuels and divest from there, moving on to renewables. But those technologies have not been coming very, very easily again to Africa. We have been talking about technological transfer. Now, those technologies that are simple, that we can be able to utilize now, and that we know are tested, and they are much better in removing or reducing the emissions, into the atmosphere, we still are very, very much behind that. And that's why I'm talking about, the question of looking at the cost implications, but also, the long-term impact. We are likely probably to change completely the way climate in different regions work, for example. If we are not very careful about how we are launching some of these particular things. I don't know how Africans can handle winter, which is not common here, for example, with the fact that we only have 60% of the population having access to electricity, for example. So I think we need to think carefully about, the long-term impact of some of these particular sciences, and before even thinking about launching them, is it possible to first and foremost really focus on what has been tested, even as we test and retest some of these new solar radiation modification technologies? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And one thing that struck me that you said that it relates to your mother, but that not just that we don't know enough about this approach, this solar radiation modification, so even the basic science may not be there, but how to convert that into stories that people can understand, including your mom. So that's something that we may need to come back to that. But let's continue, and let me come to Pablo. Pablo, you're working in humanitarian emergencies. That's your day job. And we know that with climate crisis and global heating, there will be more work for you. So in that context, how does this question of solar radiation modification look to you?
So first of all, yes, Sustainable Development Goals, no poverty, zero hunger, good health. Who could disagree with that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of disagreement with that. Because right now, there's a lot of hungry people who could be made not hungry, but who are hungry. And it is my colleagues and many others who are going to the places where trouble happens. Trouble is not the result of the absence of technological solutions that could deliver food to the hungry or health to the sick. It is in part a technological question, but mostly a question of how we as society are organizing ourselves, our incentive structures, our constraints to deal with the issues that the Sustainable Development Goals address. Things can go wrong. For example, my cat has been silent for the past 2 hours. Right now, he decided to start meowing. I don't know if you can hear him. I can hear him loudly. Will things go the way we want when things that we like are with us? Possibly not. I swear to you, I don't have a remote control. He just started. Now, let me show you a work of art by a cartoonist, Peter Cooper. It's my first original cartoon. You may not make much sense from there. It looks like an hourglass. In the bottom, there are a lot of hungry people, poor people. Sustainable Development Goals, no poverty. In the top, there's a lot of food. In the middle, the coronavirus. So right now, zero hunger is particularly difficult because providing help, whether it's food aid or helping people adapt to a changing climate so that they can grow their own food, is more difficult with coronavirus. Now, technologically, my grandma survived through the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Her brother died. I grew up in her home. She had me wash my hands all the time. I did, and now I fully understand why. At her time, the vision of developing a vaccine that takes care of a virus in 1 year would not have been conceivable. And now we have addressed this little sphere should be removable from our systems within a year or two, if we wanted. Now, what I want to highlight about solar radiation management and Sustainable Development Goals is that, of course, blocking sunlight and reducing how hot it gets in our planet will impact how much food is produced. If too much heat leads to insufficient food, then blocking sunlight, less heat, more food. The question I have, the reason why I can't answer, but I think that the questions are not well shaped, is that the shape of this hourglass, this bottleneck, will also become different once solar geoengineering becomes prominent. It is not only how much sunlight will affect food production, water, diseases, and so on. It is also how it will change the incentive structure, the allocation of resources, the ways in which states, private sector, cultural thought, political theory, sociology shape the distribution of resources. What infuriates me about what's going on with the discussion about solar radiation management is that there is the premise that if it is done, it is to address the problem of climate change. I believe that many of us would have that conversation genuinely, But once the technology becomes within reach of others, people who want to make it happen are going to be partly motivated by being the cool kid, by being the one who has the remote control on the atmosphere, the one who decides what happens and what doesn't, the one who helps make sure that their own people don't get hungry, even if someone else does. As a humanitarian worker, I love that we're having these conversations, but I want to challenge the assumption of a we. Oliver Morton says this all the time. What do you mean, should the world do solar radiation management? We will change the shape of this hourglass by merely talking about it. I want to talk about it. I want us to think about whether or not to do solar radiation management for the purposes of Sustainable Development Goal. My concern is that the motivations of those who will make it happen may be different, and that's why I celebrate C2G and others thinking about governance and culture and communication and climate justice and humanitarian consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. And that's an interesting dimension that you just brought up in your few words here about how the motivation and the framing can turn out to be quite different as there may be progress on understanding this approach, this technology, and it might turn out something quite different than what we, some of us, think. And that requires some discussion. So I think there's plenty of good material here, and I would like to encourage colleagues now, the speakers, to see if there's something following up from what the others have said that you would like to raise. But while you're thinking about that, I just want to throw this out because every one of you addressed this one way or another. The fact that we don't know enough. And if we don't know enough, that means we either just forget it, right? Or we need to do research to figure out, to know. So two questions that come out of this, and I'd welcome any one of you to look at that. But one is that if we know so little, is it even too early to talk about it, period? And then if we need to do research, how, and especially not just on the technology of getting stuff up there in the stratosphere and see what happens, but how it relates to the totality of the Sustainable Development Goals. We don't understand that. So how do we get this research done? Do we need to get scientists together, some kind of coordinated action? I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Just
maybe I can give this a try.
Matthias, go ahead.
I'm not sure I'm going to actually answer it, but on the on that central observation, we don't know enough. I think what's important, and I think many of us have alluded to that, knowing has different qualities to it, right? It matters who creates knowledge. It matters how this knowledge is contextualized, how it feeds into public conversation. And actually public conversation itself is creating knowledge. So are governance processes. They create knowledge, an interpretation of the world out there and what's to be done within that world. So this really, to me personally, comes down to every part of society having to do their very best. And I do agree with Pablo's worries that fundamentally the world in many areas is a dark place, and humans have the potential both for greatness as well as for darkness. And I think all we can do really is mobilize the best sides of what it is to be human, and that pertains as much to dealing with a pressing issue like COVID and trying to make sure that the hourglass shape is such that this discrepancy between what we can achieve and what is achieved to make everyone better off is minimized as much as possible. So I think, and this, again, this goes back to this knowledge generation. I think we need to pursue this with great effort also in the way that we generate knowledge, and Holly emphasized this as well. We need to make sure that this knowledge generation process becomes more diverse, more rich, accepts different types of the ways in which we generate knowledge. And I think this is in part also a task for those governments and those countries with large research budgets, but also governments who have large influence in international organizations to leverage those resources so that this learning can take place in this joint knowledge creation.
Okay. Any reactions to that? Holly, did I see your hand up there?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, if from my viewpoint, if it's not international, you can forget about it, creating some situation that's just because in the US, you know, we have this extreme polarization. We have this perception that science or public health recommendations are generated by elites, and then there's a rejection of them. And I think in the US, you would see that dynamic if it was researched by elites, but then there would also be national discourses. If it seemed to emerge from one country, then it would be, you know, a European idea or a Chinese idea or whatever. You know, it would be impossible to get to any kind of political consensus for moving forward one way or another, unless it was like genuinely international, genuinely diverse, I think.
Yeah. Please, Ambuj.
Ambuj and then
Thanks.
Pablo.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make a couple of points to build on this. I think one is also on Pablo's view. I mean, I think, I do agree with him in that while the question was, should we use SRM or not use SRM to get us to think about this? And I said it's too early to answer. I mean, I think it is not too early for me to answer that. I hope we don't have to use SRM, because for a number of reasons, but I think first and foremost, let me put two things out there. One is that while talking about SRM is important, I think there's a great phrase in the US that I learned, which says that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So bringing a conversation into the public arena actually is important so that many people can engage with those questions. I mean, the same thing happened with what was called carbon capture and storage more than 2 decades ago, which was then being touted as the wonder solution to the climate problem. But except that when it moved into the public space, a lot of people actually had a lot of concerns about that. So I think first of all, I think it's important to have an open discussion about that. But then there's a downside of that, right? Which is that SRM then starts altering the preference function of investments in different other activities, right? People refer to that as a moral hazard problem or a mitigation deterrence, right? That if people think that SRM is actually a possibility, then you may not do as much mitigation. So I think it does raise a whole set of questions that are very kind of that are difficult to get a handle on. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that if we're really talking about the SDGs, that if we find ourselves in a position where we're going to be using SRM, then I would also say that we're also then in a position that we will not have achieved the SDGs, because it's the same set of processes, interests, perspectives that are necessary to achieve the climate goals through mitigation, that are necessary to achieve the sustainable development goals. So at least my hope is that I hope we don't get to a situation where we've not been able to get our act together. And it is precisely as Pablo said, is because there is no we there, right? It's people pulling in different directions and all of that. But at least to the extent, I think as individuals and countries, if we are able to get our acts together to address the SDGs, I hope we will also be able to address climate through appropriate mitigation activities. But unfortunately, the world shows us that's not necessarily the case. So I think that's why I think the conversations about SRM have to be there, have to be in the open, have to be multifaceted, have to be across the world. And that I want to just end by picking up on something that Holly had said, that even engaging in a conversation actually intelligently requires capacity. I mean, it's not just people can just sit up and engage in a conversation.
Well, we knew it wasn't going to be easy. And Pablo, you had your hand up, and I'd like you to say a few words, but I just want to remind our participants, I see some questions coming in already, so we'll look at those, but please ask your questions, and then we'll come to that in a moment. But Pablo, go ahead.
Thank you. 2 quick points. First, on the matter of we don't know enough to do it. I fundamentally, categorically, and demonstrably disagree with that statement. We don't know enough to do solar radiation management responsibly.
Yeah.
We don't know enough about what will happen if we do.
Yeah.
But in order to do it, all we need to do it is to load a plane or a balloon with some magic particles made of sulfur stuff, go up high, sprinkle in the upper atmosphere, and block sunlight. And to do that, we have enough knowledge to deploy the technology, and it will take about $1 billion or $2 to just bring up technology that exists. And I predict no more than a few years, if someone really wanted and had the money and the political clout, to do it. So I have a very severe issue with the premise that we don't know enough to do it. Someone has enough knowledge and money to do it. They're not doing it now because it's not the right time, and I hope they never do it unilaterally. But it's the responsibly that needs to be put into the conversation. And let me tell you the other part that, Holly, thank you so much for bringing that up. A few days ago, I facilitated a conversation about solar radiation management with people who happen to be part of organizations who happen to have that kind of money. $1 billion on the table. If you pass the hat, we could have done geoengineering. And the conversation in the beginning seemed amicable. And very quickly, there was a cartoon artist in the room. The cartoon artist depicted the facilitator saying, "Welcome to join this dialogue." And people were coming with armored and horses and spears and machine guns and fire hoses. And there was a lion about to eat the head of someone else on the table. And that was just to begin the conversation. When this begins to happen, all options are on the table. Well, let me show you one cartoon that some will disagree because of the nature of it. But are all options on the table? Sure, let me become semi-transparent. This is how I see the world now. As you know, all options are on the table. And yes, all options are on the table. And I have to ask, what happens to people who, if they show up to this conversation, their heads are going to be beaten off by the proponents? Or they're going to be ignored by those who know how regulation works and they don't. So let's be careful in how we use words. We don't know enough to do it responsibly. And dialogue is not going to be easy. And thanks again, C2G and so many others for trying to promote the right way for dialogue and the right way for responsibility.
Thank you. And I see, Matthias, you'd like to come in? Or
not necessarily, but I'm happy to.
Okay, I'll give you a second to reflect then. But Pablo, just a quick follow-up to your previous analogy, which I thought was interesting. If we see this hourglass and removing the virus or whatever, but then would we end up in a situation where right now it's challenging enough when we talk about SRM, solar radiation modification, just simply in the context directly of addressing the climate crisis. But if people started coming in with completely different objectives and narratives of fixing the food situation, of reducing the temperatures in certain part of the world because it's too hot. It's always been too hot, you know. What's the right global temperature? Should be one below, one above. It can get pretty hairy, right? And then I don't know. I mean, where do we go from there?
So you said if people start coming in with different intents, well, people will start coming in. People are beginning now to a little bit notice and show up, but very soon, whether it's about zero poverty and hunger or global geopolitical dominance, some folks are going to start to show up, and we are not equipped to govern that technology. We're not equipped to facilitate that dialogue, and we're not able to have candid conversations that enable different voices to be on a somewhat equal footing because there's too much asymmetry of knowledge, too much asymmetry of power. The efforts by Decimals and many others to try to bring up scientists from Bangladesh, political scientists from Africa, and so on, very desirable. There's such asymmetry that we need more. What I have certainty, having observed the reasons why humanitarian works exist, and I have worked in 65 countries, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, Guatemala, Burkina Faso, you name it. Sometimes there's famine in a country that is exporting food. So there are more complex issues behind merely the atmospheric chemistry and physics. And it's going to be tough. I wish us all good luck.
Okay, Matthias, and after Matthias, I'd like to start looking at some questions from the audience. Okay, so Matthias, over to you.
Okay.
I mean, we have several starting points, right? And sometimes when we say we are rightfully criticized for not being specific enough. I think there's work cut out for pretty much any actor in society today to resolve these global challenges. We have to leverage also the institutions that we already have. And I think one of the challenges seen so far is we're not even agreeing, like I said, on the object that we're talking about. And perhaps to just add this to the conversation as an example, the operative definition of what used to be called geoengineering mostly is so unclear that it's overlapping both between mitigating climate change clearly and these imaginary global interventions in the sky. And this is so broad that I feel personally we haven't had many of the conversations that we could have been having had we started on the basis of a clearer understanding of what we actually mean. But this just as an additional thought.
Okay. Thank you. Now, I said we would start the questions on the floor, but actually I'd like to do one more question before that. And I'm looking at Charles in particular, but maybe others have a thought on that as well. That especially when we talk about we and us, and I sometimes have a sense that since most of the research work and the reflection on these issues related to solar radiation modification have been taking place in the global north. There's something elsewhere as well, but most of it still is in the global north. And aren't we coming back to the traditional ideals of colonialism here, that the North comes and says, this is the problem, this is the solution. And how does that look from your perspective, Charles, and maybe others as well? And then we'll go to the questions from the participants. So.
Thank you so much. And that's a very, very interesting question that you did ask. And I want to answer it going back to that very good example, that hourglass model that Pablo actually shared with us, which I think it speaks a lot. And of course, that bottleneck can actually be anything. Right now it's COVID. Before COVID, it was inequality, it was global geopolitics, it was the whole question about equity and all that, because you must view climate change not just as an environmental issue. And climate change is not an issue that can just be dealt with science only, because it is a humanitarian issue. We look at it as a health issue. It is an economic issue, and therefore it's much broader than just the science part of it. But now going back to your question regarding these things being read from the north, and you brought in a very interesting perspective that probably could this be viewed really like colonialism again, and so on and so forth. This is what I want to say. For a long, long, long time, decisions, whether in climate change, whether in development or any other field, have always been top-down or have always adopted the top-down approach. And on this realization, there was the formation of what we call the Global Adaptation Commission, which is being led by Ban Ki-moon. I think we're all aware of that. And one thing they're doing, one of the assignments and what they're coming up with is what they're calling principles of locally led actions. And so far, they have come up with about 8 principles of locally led action on realization that solutions to climate change can only be effective if decisions are influenced all the way from the grassroots coming up. And that is why, on a very serious note, I keep referring to a hypothetical example of my mother back at home. You say the wearer of the shoe is the one who knows where it pinches most. So that rural woman back in the village who is already experiencing the impact of climate change needs to be on the table to contribute to solutions and what I would call appropriate technologies that they think are actually useful at that particular level, and so on and so forth. That is not to say that science should not be advanced and that we should not be thinking about even higher level issues of looking at how we can be able to address this. But I think it has to have the grassroots touch. We need as much as possible to involve, the grassroots. We need as much as possible to involve those who are most affected, because I think we also have to look at the issues of priorities. Like I mentioned, there is a lot of inequality even in dealing with climate change the way it is now. If you look at the negotiations that normally happen every year, that is the conference of parties, negotiations, where parties come together and we are negotiating on simple issues on how we can be able to address climate change at this particular level. We always find, coalitions, the G77 and the allies. We have, the Western countries again and the allies and so on and so forth. Where it should be an issue where people are sitting on the ground, on the common table to think about common solutions, but you find people pulling their directions, so that people are always looking at their interest. And what is my interest? You even had countries pulling from the Paris Agreement. I want to go to US, pulling from the Central Agreement, even though they contribute 18% of the emissions. So even at this particular level, we cannot be able to agree on how to address climate change and accept the reality the way it is and see who is most affected and what needs to be done. What will happen with these technologies when those who have resources and who can be able to quickly acquire, these technologies and therefore modify, the climate around their region to their region without necessarily knowing the impact, in a different other region, how is this going to play? Remember, you're talking about justice, talking about climate change. And therefore, I think it's not just a scientific issue, but we need to bring about humanitarian issue there. We need to think about the issues of equity. We need to bring even gender issues because, again, there are multiple levels, of vulnerability when it comes to climate change. So it's a whole broad spectrum that we need to think about, including bringing the even religious perspectives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Ambuj, you would like to react to that?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think you talked about, you used the phrase colonialism and northern-led. I mean, I think it does give me some concern. It does give me some concern. I mean, if one doesn't even have to go back to colonial history, one just has to look at the history of how things have played out in the climate domain, right? And how northern countries have played southern countries against one another and used their divergent kind of understanding of the climate situation and their own interests in pulling apart certain formations and all of that. So in the end, I mean, I do worry about the power dynamics of if SRM does become an option on the table, then how it plays out, and even whether it appears as an option on the table. And so, Pablo, thank you for actually bringing up the word responsibly. I mean, I'm glad you did that, and I'm sorry if I didn't, if I gave the wrong impression. But even when you use the term responsibly, the question is who decides what's responsible, right? So I think the dynamics here really play out, and the dynamics are relating to dynamics of knowledge, dynamics of power, and dynamics of concern. Developing countries, many developing countries are much more likely to be concerned about climate impacts and therefore potentially willing to think about as SRM as a possibility if it is seen as a real option, as opposed to other countries. So I think it has a possibility to play out in ways that I think we can't even really fully anticipate at this time. And so it is, the reality is it's a sorry situation that we have to be thinking about it. That we can't just say this option cannot be on the table. I wish we had our act together, but unfortunately we don't. But if we are actually saying that we have to think about whether this option is on the table, then all of these questions comes out. Who decides what option, what form of option, and who decides whether it's on the table, who decides to implement, who pulls the trigger, who has it right? And if there are actually problems, then who has the right to terminate? I think anyway, so again, as I said, I think, and that's where the dynamics of inequality in power and knowledge really come in. And as I said, we don't have to go back to colonial times. We only have to look at how things played out in the climate domain to see that that plays out in very complex and unanticipated ways.
And that, of course, brings us back to what Matthias started with, is that this broad conversation, different stakeholders, and it gets complicated. But if we want to address these issues, we just need to find a way to do that. But I would like to come to look at some questions from the floor, so to speak. And while we do that, I of course encourage participants to ask some more questions. But first, I think I'd like to go to a question that was posed by Michael McCracken, and this is sort of my way of putting this together. But we know that the impacts of climate change will be severe if things continue the way. I think many of us have said that. So if we recognize that, we also, there's indications, says Michael, that the IPCC has been conservative, and it actually could be even worse than what we think. And so if that is the case, then are we, and has there been significant adverse impacts suggested from the use of SRM? And if not, don't we need a better balanced approach to look at this potential approach with or without, to address the issue of climate change with or without SRM? I think that's sort of the essence of his question. So I don't know if any of you would like to have a go at that.
I typed something kind of related to that. Hello, Michael. First of all, very good to have you with us. And thanks for your work opening doors on this front. I'm here partly because of what you did with Asilomar. So, yes, we know that under some circumstances, some consequences of geoengineering, solar radiation management, would be worse for some than for others. And depending on how you deploy it and how, for some places, it would get worse with solar radiation management than without. Even if the majority of the rest of the world ends up being better off, what we know about atmospheric processes, when we model atmospheric circulation and the like, we know that of the many possible ways of deploying, almost all of them will create some losers somewhere. I'm not determining here that if there is one loser, then don't do it. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is, to your question about would any of the panelists object if a volcanic eruption blocks sunlight and cooled out the planet? Well, when that happens, the Sahel experiences its worst droughts. And you can look at my answer in the chat. So I ask you, if I and my colleagues are working in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and so on, where people are already hungry, and someone says, let's solve the world problem of global warming by doing something that messes up the Sahel, I have to ask the question, wait, before you do that, would you like to call Mumina Ndiaye, my colleague from Mopti in northern Mali, where there's armed conflict and there's droughts and there's occasional flood and so on? Shouldn't this person and this community be involved in the discussion? And it's not easy. I wish more people well-being. I don't feel comfortable determining the sacrifice zones. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be people suffering in order for others to be better. I am suffering by doing my work. I wish I could be doing something more healthy. But it's complicated. And it will continue to be complicated. At least we're talking about it.
Okay. All right. Any other reactions to this? If not, I'd like to go to another question from the participants. This is from Francis Pope, and this is specifically to Holly, referring, Holly, to your recent book where you discuss the importance of different time frames. And of course, you have a situation where the SDGs are meant for 2030, then SRM, even if somebody decided, Ambuj decided that we need to do this, it will take some 10 years or so to know enough to get it going. So is this the right framework that we're talking about? Any reactions from you or anybody else?
Yeah, I do have a thought on that. I mean, the SDGs are aspirational. And the reason I think they're the right framework is because of the process through which they were produced. I mean, it was one of the, I know other people on the call know more about this, but it's a consensus process. So the world came up with these, and that's a rare thing. So that's why I think it's a very relevant framework.
And would you agree that in the same line, it is likely that beyond 2030, there will be something else, similar, better, worse, whatever the world is able to come up with at that time? But it's unlikely that in 2030, we'll stop thinking about these kinds of goals and objectives for the world. Would you?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the framework we come up with will be so radically different, because some of the things like, I don't know, clean water, gender equality, they're pretty fundamental. So I think they're a good framework for guiding research, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that briefly. I mean, as some of you might know, that I've tried exploring together with a broad range of colleagues and friends and experts across the globe to sort of map out hypothetically what could be the implications across the SDGs if someone were to do SRM. And of course, this is a very difficult thing to do at this point, because as we've emphasized, the knowledge is so sparse and the understanding is so limited. But it's still, I think, a very useful exercise, even if, 2030, a new set of goals might emerge. It is today, in my view, still the best available expression of, what is this aspiration that the international community has committed itself to. And as such, I think it, like Holly says, it won't fundamentally change even towards mid-century. I think those issues, as Pablo put it, it's very hard to disagree really with the issues that are brought up in the SDGs.
Okay. Yes, Ambuj?
I have to say, I was looking at Mike McCracken's long comment and then the question, and basically saying that, if I understood correctly, he's saying that not using SRM would be an injustice against the South that may suffer the impacts of climate change. But the fact that the South is going to be suffering, if you're really concerned about injustice, then the way to address that is actually by mitigating climate change, so that you don't have those impacts of those climate impacts. So I actually have, I guess I have a fundamental problem with SRM being proposed as an instrument of justice, whereas it really is an instrument of, a very crude instrument to try to address some results of great injustice. And so I think I do want to kind of put that out there, that I think that framing is a fundamentally problematic framing.
Mm-hmm. Pablo?
Yeah, just thank you, Ambuj, for that very valid point. Fully resonating with the motivations that make Michael and others say, but wouldn't it lead to more just results to have fewer hungry people and so on? I really resonate with Ambuj, especially in this aspect. The proponents of geoengineering have a variety of motivations. And I have no doubt that Michael and many others are genuinely motivated by the well-being of humanity. What I don't like is the prospect that one day the actual deployers, the actual entities, whether it's messy unilateral deployment by a state or some other weird thing, the actual deployment may be done for some selfish reasons with the narrative skin of we are going to give you the global justice that we think you deserve. And that makes me deeply uncomfortable because in the past it has led to trouble. And I can't imagine, at a minimum, the feeling of those marginalized from the decision being told, we're doing this on your behalf, in your name. They're going to be pissed. And we are trying to create spaces for them to enable those who are proposing to do it for justice to consult with those who want justice, so there can be a more informed portrayal of what is desirable.
Thank you. I think we lost Charles. There may be some connection challenge, so let's hope he's able to rejoin us and continue the discussion. So any other reactions at this point to these? If not, then we can go to the next question. And there are a few. I'm just trying to be maybe one issue related to research, and we've talked a little bit about that, but maybe we need to do a little bit more. But I think that the question about how much research do we need to do, how much precision do we need to know about these issues before we, somebody, some institution, some gathering, some country can take decisions that, okay, now we're ready to do this or not do it. So how far do we need to go? I mean, don't we know, we know something, we don't know everything. You used the word, Pablo, responsible implementation. So let's use that definition. Is that, how much do we need to do for responsible decisions? Any reactions to that? Pablo.
So I'm an Argentinian white male. I can't speak more than is fair, so please silence me as needed. In the recent event that I mentioned earlier, one of the participants from NCAR, an atmospheric scientist, very kindly asked the question, look, I'm a modeler. I understand your concern that maybe there could be some part of the world where some people lose and that would be unjust. Can you give me a metric of what is the threshold that would constitute fair impacts so we can begin to assess that? And it was fascinating. It's the first time I'm asked that. So thank you, Jaga, for posing that question. I don't know how to put a metric on responsible or fair or just outcomes of atmospheric parameters, such as precipitation or temperature. What I do know, and I look forward to that conversation, I think that that's the right angle. It shouldn't be only about, so many degrees Celsius on average. It's also about consequences for locations for people over time. Going back to this thing, in addition to the research on how much food would there be with or without solar radiation management, how many poor people will be displaced from their homes in the coastlines because the sea level is rising with or without solar. In addition to those physical science, atmospheric science questions, etc., I would really want to have more research on how the conversation about or the deployment of geoengineering would change the shape of how decisions are made, how incentive structures are happening. One question that I have no answer is, what will happen to humanitarian funding if the planet becomes a managed system fully, including the atmosphere? There's usually the rule that the bazaar rule, if someone breaks it, that entity is responsible for fixing it. So right now, a catastrophic hurricane in Nicaragua, category 5 a few days ago, the world is helping because it was bad fortune in the lottery. But if it begins to be perceived as manipulated by humans, even if it ends up leading to better results, I predict humanitarian funding will change. I don't know how. I predict it will change. We need those answers as well as the atmospheric parameters.
But Pablo, you talked about the role of SRM in looking at the shape of the hourglass. But there are many other forces in society that can have an impact. Forget SRM. Should we not be focused on working with those forces that are trying to expand the size of that passageway in the middle of the hourglass, instead of messing around with things like SRM?
Absolutely. I'm a system dynamics modeler. I used to spend my days creating mathematical models of impacts of climate and levers for decision to turn on and off something or moving a knob. And now, in addition to some of that, I'm supporting anti-racism endeavors, because I realize that what needs to happen is to enhance how much we care for each other. As long as the conversation about solar radiation management is guided by the question, how do we better care for each other? I'm fine with reaching conclusions. What concerns me is that the caring side is hard. And as you said, Janos, the shape of the hourglass is mostly determined by other things. If and when SRM becomes more prominent, it will be one more of many. And that interaction is the one I'm particularly curious about as a scientist, as a researcher.
Okay. Colleagues, do you have any questions to each other? If yes.
Janos, I just wanted for a second to come in on your question of how much research is enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or when do we know research is enough? I agree with Pablo. I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that. I think, Ulrich Beck has this great line in his book, The Risk Society. He said that we are in a situation now that in many cases, we know the risks of the experiment only when we run the experiment, because there's no way to know a priori the full range of risks. So we do need to do a lot of research. We do need to try to get the answers, but I don't think we will ever we've not got all the answers we want. But I do think what we need to be paying attention is the process by which we're engaging in this. The process by which we're engaging in the scientific research, the research about how do we think about governance structures. And at the minimum, I think we have to be responsible in terms of the process of how we are making sure people can participate, that we have a diversity of voices, that we are able to make sure that we are open to all different kinds of questions. We are open to the fact that we have to think about that. If we don't know all the answers, do we need to think about regimes of insurance or whatever, that in case things don't go the way we want? I think we need to be thinking about all of that. And so the process of that exploration has to be the one I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to make sure that talking about the phrase responsible, that process is actually put together responsibly. And then, I don't think we'll ever have full scientific knowledge or have the optimal governance structure. I think we can't expect that, but at least we need to make sure that as we engage in these, we do it in a way that's open, transparent, inclusive, respectful, and all of that, that whatever dimensions of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, I'd like to add to that very briefly. I think that's what I kind of alluded to with saying the quality of the knowledge generation itself, the process that results in what we see as knowledge. I think is really the next big challenge, where we have a lack. We're missing an institution or organizations recognizing a responsibility, enabling diverse researchers becoming more engaged and building up a capacity to take part in global conversations on SRM all over the world, and not just in a handful of Western countries as it is at the moment. And that's really what's missing for more bottom-up conversation that takes into account the huge diversity that we have, the diversity in geography, in economic and social conditions, and all that. And as long as this conversation is driven by us Western academics, small groups of people, we have a very big problem. And there is a missing link that results really in resources flowing to researchers all over the world to start looking at these questions.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. We're coming close. We have 4 or 5 minutes left, and maybe I just wanted to throw this out to you. We've talked a lot about the we and the us and who is the we, and well, we haven't talked enough of who are not part of the we explicitly. You know, we're kind of assuming that there are groups of people, stakeholders who are not part of the we. So who are these excluded people? Excluded stakeholders are not just people, groups, etc.
I think non-humans would be part of that.
Who? Sorry?
Non-humans.
Oh, okay. Non-humans, all right. That's interesting, yeah. That includes Pablo's cat, whom we haven't seen yet, but we heard about him. Okay. Any other, because we didn't talk much about future generations. We didn't talk much about what happens, you know, after 2030, 2050, 2100. That's another interesting dimension, isn't it?
Yeah, in some sense, you know, it is like the nuclear issue, right? When we're talking about nuclear waste, that we're generating waste that future generations are going to have, we're making a choice for future generations. I think with something like SRM, which is effectively you know, kind of a longer term engagement with the atmosphere, we're committing future generations to engage with the global climate in that way, in a sense. So that point, I think Pablo had it in the chat about humans not yet born, and your point about future generations, I think it's absolutely true. By making certain choices now, or potentially thinking about something like SRM, we are committing future generations to well, biasing their future in a particular way. Mm-hmm. So you're correct.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? If not, then I would like to come to the end of our discussion, and I would like to ask each of you if you have any sort of last thoughts based on the discussion we just had, something that you've either taken away or something where we really need to do some homework for the future. Anybody would like to start? Pablo.
So linking to the previous question, let me see if I can change this again. There we are. So what now? Who is not here and could or should be? This is another cartoon by our colleague Rebecca Rivola. And it shows a capital city out in the horizon with shining building and people talking about inclusive and participatory and collaborative. And one person reaching out to this mother carrying a bucket with a child, possibly poor, possibly not having enough water, therefore being in trouble with many sustainable development goals. Stakeholders, why aren't you engaging? And I just want to fully acknowledge the enormous difficulty of having a process that is fair and participatory and just and inclusive, but we need to continue to aspire for that. And as a member of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center, and at large of the humanitarian sector, we're so grateful for each of you, each of the members in the audience, and so many others who are trying to make this for caring for others, including the non-humans that Holly referred to, and the scientists who want to give us answers. So thanks C2G again for the opportunity to grow this dialogue.
Thank you, Pablo. Any other quick reactions, but quick ones? Matthias, thank you.
Well, I would just generally encourage everyone who ever feels inhibited in talking to a different community or group or type of actor to not feel held back just because you don't understand where others are coming from. And actually this goes as well within academia, talking between disciplines, but also between academia and policy in both directions. I sense there is a great reluctance in asking dumb questions, and I think that's been something that has held us back.
Thank you, Matthias. Charles?
Thank you so much, and I agree with my colleagues. But on your question about who are those people that are not part of we, even as we talk about the unborn, even amongst ourselves, we have so many we's because there are multiple levels of vulnerability. And like I mentioned, and like Pablo mentioned, really, we need to have all stakeholders on the table. But above all, let us have bottom-top approach, information of whatever is happening. Scientists must continue with their work. Right now, scientists are working on a vaccine to this particular virus we're talking about. So scientists working on solar radiation modification must continue. Those who are working on checking whether we can get some more rad in Mars and go and live there, they should continue working. Science has its own role and its own place. But let us not forget to address the realities of the world we have in today. Let us pick the low-lying fruits. Can we be able to implement whatever development blueprints we have? Can we be able to honor, the different agreements, the different documents that we have that are heading or supporting us in heading towards, reducing the global emissions or temperature rise below 1.5? The current national determined contributions submitted by countries are only taking us to 3-degree trajectory. Can we talk about the issues about, enhancing our ambitions and making sure that we lower that? So let's continue, but also let us address the reality of the world today. Let us have locally led, initiatives.
Thank you, Charles. Very briefly, Ambuj, Holly, do you have any quick last
Sure,
words?
I think I'll just say, I'll just make 2 very quick points. One is that, first of all, thank you very much for this very valuable and I think very interesting conversation. I agree with Pablo that I'm really glad you're doing these kind of conversations. I should say that even as we talk about SRM, I think we must constantly make sure that we keep mitigation front and center. That major way to engage with the climate problem is mitigation, and SRM is only in a sense a side issue. So I think that doesn't mean we don't think about that. And the second thing that for me is that I think the more I think about the SRM issue and its complexities and the possible ways in which you can mess things up, I think to me at least the lesson there is to engage with it with humility.
Thank you. Holly, the last word.
Yeah, I think that if we want to have this kind of open, inclusive discussion with many we's, we need to fix the platforms that we're using for digital interaction and, algorithms that put forth emotional or hate-filled things above reasoned speech. So please tell your billionaires that you talk with.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. And with that, we're done with this session, a little bit over time, but thank you. And we move forward somehow. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.